thank you for braving the elements tonight. I think this was the end of summer that just occurred this morning. And as always, we are a bit at the mercy of whatever time it is. But I think the importance and interest of our guest tonight is certainly merits braving the rain and bad weather. And I'm very happy to have here Jorge Lanzaro, who's a good friend from 15 years back, and who has done a lot of service to research, particularly in political science on Latin America, particularly on two subjects. It's presidentialism and it's the social democratic model, the corporativism. Dr. Lanzaro has his PhD from the University of Paris and was for a long time both the director and the founder of political science in Uruguay. When I was at the Instituto de Ciencia Política in Montevideo, it was still a relatively small institute, which has now grown to become a very important center for political science, and that is very much the work of Professor Lanzaro. And I think the subject of today, which we have also been discussing earlier today, has been exactly the establishment of social democracy in Latin America, which is a subject that is coming to the fore. And what possibilities are there? What models are there? And I think this is an interesting subject to explore also between Sweden, with its experience of social democratic models, and Latin America. What can be put in place? What lessons, experiences can be brought forward? These are all themes for coming discussion. And after the presentation by Jorge Lanzaro, I hope that you will all want to join with comments, questions, suggestions. But for now, I'll leave the floor to Jorge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fredrik, for the invitation, and you all to come. Yeah, it's very nice to be here in Stockholm. I was telling Fredrik and other friends that I was here for the first time in '65 as a student, and in the times that Sweden tried to help Latin American young fellows to avoid the Cuban way and come to the social democratic way. This was at that moment was not very successful indeed, but now almost 50 years after, we have this possibility of social democratic governments. Perhaps it's not a sort of it's not yet a social democratic regime. That means I make this distinction, and we come into that, and I would like to talk about this subject here in the motherhood of social democracy. So the idea is just well, as you know, that we have in Latin America a very important event, that is that almost a dozen of countries having left governments or center-left governments, including most of the very important countries in Latin America, as Brazil, Argentina, and others. So this wave of the left in Latin America, it's important because there are many governments. It's important because there are governments coming from elections, from free elections, and even repeated elections, re-elected. And they are coming after the cycle of liberal reforms in the 90s, in a point that we could say it's a sort of inflection since the beginning of the century, with the possibility of having a sort of post-liberal cycle or post-liberal policies with a interrogation mark. So in this wave we have very different kind of governments that can be classified on different bases and different typologies, but what from begin to classify them, we can start with a sort of the political nature of the governments. The political nature of the governments, mainly depending on the existence or not of a strong or at least competitive party system. And this is the main distinction we can find in this left governments, in this wave, and of course out of the left governments, other kind of governments, governments with parties or without parties, governments working in let's say plural and competitive party systems or not, and governments with the let's say with the strong opposition, and governments without opposition or without an organized and strong competitive opposition. This is a very common feature to take into account in political science approaches, but this is also something that is a very good distinction for the Latin American, the new Latin American left governments. So, what about this social democratic governments? First, just a couple of. You can see I'm not. No estoy obstaculizando la vista. What I'm saying that there is the possibility of sort of a new generation of social democratic governments in Latin America and in three countries: Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. Of course, Brazil since Lula and Dilma, Chile during the Lagos and during Bachelet first government. I hope it will be a second government, so I can continue with my subject. It's not only a political bet. And Uruguay also during two consecutive governments since Vasquez's first presidency. So, what about this idea of generations? We can. This is the first question or the first doubt. Can we talk of generations of social democracy? There is immediately the discussion when the discussion about the possibility of different generations, and there is a sort of, well, many authors saying that there is a sort of what in the French wine would be appellation contrôlée. The name of social democracy, it's sacralized for the classic, really old Northern European social democracy, and that's all. And that's, of course, but we can argue, and this could be one of the points of the discussion, that there can be social democratic generation in different periods in different regions, and which is more important indeed, within distinct modes of capitalist development, mainly during the Keynesian era, which was the let's say the wonderful years for social democracy, and now in sort of neoliberal or liberal times. This is a big, huge difference, and there is a big discussion in Europe since the first governments in Southern Europe, the left governments in Southern Europe, about the possibility of having a sort of social democracy settings in liberal times. So I won't stay in this question and just mention the problem, and mention also the idea of at least three generations: the classic social democracy of Northern Europe by the end of the 30s. Well, I think Sweden was the first, and especially after the Second World War. That was the golden years for social democracy. Afterwards, we can have the idea of late social democracies in Southern Europe since the 70s and the 80s. And Spain is the most relevant case, but also Portugal and Greece. And I hope this is not something that is talking about the future of social democracy in Latin America, if we have these three cases which are considered as sort of peaks in Europe now with the crisis. And now this third generation of social democratic governments in South America: Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. The first strong comparison could be precisely the comparison between the three very to the south experiences: Spain, Greece, and Portugal, versus Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. And this is because two big reasons. The first is that all these experiences are coming after democratic transitions, in some cases after long periods of authoritarian regimes. And the second reason is that all these cases are coming during the liberal times, after these golden years of the Keynesian era. And if you think that Felipe González government was parallel to Thatcher government, so it was already working in that time. So there is a sort of structural determinism saying that if you don't have the original conditions, if you don't have the conditions that make possible the classic social democracy, you won't have any possibility to build up a social democratic government or a social democratic regime. And it's the discussion I want just to put you on the table to discuss today with you. And the first idea is that structural conditions, structural restrictions, economic, social, political, institutional restrictions are very important, but at the same time we should take into account the action of the parties and the governments, the ideology and the power resources of these parties and these governments. And this is what I would like to present in this presentation. So the other point of discussion is about how to define which is the concept of social democracy. There you have two big branches. The first idea of social democracy is that social democracy is a kind of a pattern of public policy. And this is very it's an important approach when it comes to the type of welfare states built up by different countries in Europe mainly, and the typology of welfare state, it's often considering the possibility of having this social democratic welfare state, social democratic kind of policy. And this is one indeed very important approach. Well, what is social democratic? Of course, inclusion and redistribution, equity, and different. This is common to many governments, especially to other left governments. But when it comes to democratic improvements, when you come to universal social policy, and when you come to the type of social policy, for instance, you know, or you may know that money transfers have been very common in Latin America, and not only Latin America, but Latin America since, let's say, Salinas or Cedillo. Starting with Cedillo, money transfers have been a general social policy in all over Latin America in different governments, from the right to the left, center right, center left. So that's the idea that the money transfers could be more strongly considered as institutional rights or sort of clientelistic offers from government. That makes it an important difference. So building up this type of social policy is also building up a sort of components of the political and social citizenship. So this is one approach. The other approach is to consider the definition or the concept of social democracy depending on the nature of the party in government and the nature of the government itself, based mainly in this idea that the party systems are the main important factor to consider regarding the nature of the government. And this is a discussion. We can consider that these two approaches are rival explanations or rival concepts, or you can consider that the social democratic nature, political nature of a government, it's what leads to social democratic policies and social democratic social policies. Well, this is also the big one of the big struggles between political scientists and sociologists. So this is just a point. What about the political concept? Well, it's long. It's very long, perhaps. I don't know if you can. Well, it's social democratic governments are those made up of institutionalized left parties with a strong kinship to the labor movement and socialist leanings, even if they don't have the name, which have undergone processes of political change, process of party adaptation, and replaced their revolutionary or radical ideologies with moderate but effective reformism. And that, as a result of the political and electoral options, the political and electoral strategies that they adopt when they act and when they work in the framework of competitive and rather institutionalized party systems. That's the very long definition which I offer, and which is very close to many definitions gave by several authors about the so-called electoral socialism. Once you choose the electoral way, you have to respect the electoral rules, and then you have to move towards reformist moderation, ideological and political moderation, and try to make reformism effective in a very competitive scenario. That's perhaps the first important lesson that many of the left parties in Latin America learn from the crisis, from the problems, the political processes in Latin America in the 60s and the 70s. And of course, the big lesson of the Chile tragedy and all other tragedies around. The idea, the bitter idea, is that the societies are not on the left. There is perhaps 25–30% of the citizens placed at the left side of the spectrum. There are, let's say, 30, 35 or 40% of people placed in the right side of the. Usually the main part of the electorate is placed in the center. So if you want to make revolutions, you can make revolutions, but if you want to win elections, you have to move to the center, and move to the center is be more moderate, be more have let's say coalitions with other parties going to the center, or, which is also the case, and it is particularly the case of Uruguay, the same left party going to the left and arriving to a majority position with the change, the party change. So this is something that many authors, Kirchheimer mainly, perhaps people, if you are familiar with the political science literature, Kirchheimer, Chevotsky, and the French people, which are usually less well known. There you can have this PowerPoint if you like, and this idea is that the social democratic governments are those governments made up by an institutional left. What does it mean? It means that the parties in government, or the parties trying to arrive to government, are rather institutionalized, and also, and this is the crucial fact, that they work in the frame of plural and competitive party systems. Indeed, this is the more important feature. And then if you see the Latin American landscape, you will find left governments with these features in Brazil, in Chile, in Uruguay, and you find left governments without these features in other countries, very clearly in Venezuela or Ecuador, for instance. this these governments has face this contradiction, which is a contradiction making part of the very social democratic nature. From one side, they have to go to the center and try to moderate their positions, to win elections and to keep the government also, and at the same time the same political competition, the same inter-party competition and intra-party competitions is moving toward reformism. This is something that it's very clear in these cases that we are discussing today. And this is the discussion is then when these parties follow the social democratic path, when they arrive to government, they could just make a sort of social liberal government, let's say sort of social retouches to liberalism, or they can make effective social democratic policies and changes. And this is one question that can be put to the experience of Brazil, the experience of Chile, and the experience of Uruguay. So policy regimes, that means liberalism or liberal policy, even conducted by parties with different ideologies, or real reformism, even moderate, gradual reformism. That is the big question. And the answer can perhaps come from the what I call the social democratic potential, and that means, first of all, legacies, and second, legacies in the sense of, I'm sorry, this is all the numbers. I'm sorry. Legacies means historical patterns in terms of state structure and social policy and economic policy patterns, and also the recent past. And this is a very important. You know that there is a strong tradition in the discussion of public policies about heritage, and heritage in the long term and heritage in the recent past. When it comes to the recent past, we have to look at the let's say the liberal period, the pro-market reform period, which has been very different in these countries, in these three countries. If you have on one side the Pinochet policy with a very radical liberal politics, and on the other side, the recent past for the left could be Fernando Henrique Cardoso in Brazil, or other presidents from the traditional parties in Uruguay, with a very gradual liberal policies. That's the main difference between Chile and Brazil, and Chile on one side and Brazil and Uruguay on the other side. The other important factors to be considered It's the power resources. I hope that there won't be another one. The political resources, not only the institutional legacies, but the power coefficient. That means I will come to that. The power of the trade unions and their relationship with business. I can just explain very quickly. Power, institutional legacy already done. What about power coefficient? Power coefficient we can measure in, let's say, in 3 circles. The power of measure we can measure in seats in parliament first. The power of the left party in government with respect of the whole left parties, and there you have important differences. For instance, the Socialist Party in Chile does not cover the entire left, because there is still the Communist Party and other parties on the left. The PT in Brazil doesn't cover the entire left. The Frente Amplio in Uruguay does cover the whole left. It doesn't exist the left outside the Frente Amplio. It does exist just a minimum. That's one circle. The second circle is the power of the left party in the government coalition, if there is any government coalition. And this is the case for Chile, and this has been the case for Chile, and it is the case for Brazil. In the case of Chile and Brazil, Lagos, Bachelet, Lula, and Dilma did govern with coalitions, and coalitions with different features, with different partners. Of course, for the Socialist Party in Chile, the main partner was the Christian Democracy, and for the PT in Brazil, the main partner was the PMDB, the Partido del Movimiento Democrático de Brasil, which has been the partner of all the governments since the 85, 86, all the governments from, let's say, from the center to the left. So this is the second circle. And the third circle is the power of the left party or the power of the coalition, considering the entire party system, the others, the opposition, the bloc of the center to the right. And this is also very important, and the levels, the distances, also very important. This is one measure that can be done looking at the seats in parliament. Well, the political support measure on the seats in parliament, but it has also to be measured considering ideological distance. If you have, let's say, in Chile, the ideological distance between the concertación in government and the bloc of the right or center right, if you want, it's quite big. It's about 5 points. I mean, the middle of the road. And instead, in Brazil and Uruguay, the ideological distance during the first and second Lula government and during the Vasquez government was much more short and around 2.5, 2.4. That means that the, let's say, the possibility of consensus about certain reforms and the possibility of dissent about certain reforms changes very much according to this ideological distance, and the possibility of the reforms, the let's say the atrevimiento, the osadía, well,
audaciousness.
yeah, of the political initiatives. It's graduated. It is ex ante or ex post graduated by this ideological distance, and this is very clear for the reforms in Chile, for instance, which has been very, very gradual and very moderate, because there was on the other side an important rival, well, at the beginning even with the presence of Pinochet himself. So this is a matter of power coefficient, and it's the other pillar of any social democratic setting are the trade unions. And the trade unions, the power of the trade unions can be measured, consider the degree of unity, of central organization of the unions, and the degree of political unionism. If you can measure, you can tell us something about that, since you have been working on this subject in Chile and Uruguay. And there you have different situations. In the case of Chile, and the situation of the unions, it's very weak and fragmented, and the brotherhood between the Socialist Party and the unions it's weaker. In Brazil, the brotherhood between the PT and the CUT is still strong, but the CUT, it's one of the 5 unions, central unions in Brazil, and the landscape, it's a landscape of very sort of quite fragmented unions. This is one important feature, and when you come to the Uruguayan case, you can see that the brotherhood is still very strong, and the unions are still in a unique central organization. This depends very much on the way that the parties and the unions pass through the liberal times, and this can be analyzed, if you want, with an consideration of the Uruguayan case, if you want to go inside the Uruguayan case. I don't know if it's, but perhaps we can make a break and then give you the possibility of some questions before going to the Uruguayan case.
Yes.
What do you think?
Any clarification on this general model, and then we'll go on to speak about Uruguay more specifically. It's an interesting. All clear, it seems. Yes.
Concerning that, I thought it was, well, the whole thing was very interesting, and I noticed particularly about this heritage thing you mentioned.
Yes.
And because you said that the classic social democracies, you mentioned it was from the 30s, mostly from European countries. What do you have to say concerning the case in South America of the fascismo in Uruguay, also for example, period government of Irigoyen in Argentina, and or the radical party of Aguirre Cerda, for example, in Chile during the 20s and 30s.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be early social democratic heritage kind of governments?
Well, they be good heritage, but not social democratic. Not in this definition, because they are not built up by left parties with brotherhood with unions. This is the main difference. Social democracy has been it is a very common word terms for many political settings. Costa Rica, Liberación Nacional has been known as social democratic. Carlos Andrés Pérez and Acción Democrática were known as social democracy or social democratic terms, and they belong to the social to the international, to the socialist international. And Fernando Henrique Cardoso has a party which is named the Social Democratic Party of Brazil. So you have many names for the same. That if we follow this definition that I propose, left socialist parties with a strong brotherhood with the unions, which passed through a very important process of party adaptation. This idea of a specific subject can change the name of the political event. But of course, these are very important legacies to build up social democratic regimes. If you have, as you said, Bajísmo in Uruguay or other situations which can be considered very favorable to sort of, well, the type of welfare state built up in other periods, in, let's say, for instance, Costa Rica and Uruguay, are very important to what you are trying to build up now.
I have a question regarding the issue of trade unions and the organization of dissent, and how my question is, like you said, there is a relationship between the organization of the new generation of social democratic countries in these cases and their relationship with the trade unions, right?
Yeah.
And this you mentioned that there are different kind of relationships between these three countries. My question is how these trade unions were changed by the fact that they have these left parties in the government, and how they, I mean, what did they contribute to social reform, or were they stopped by a sort of a sort of sympathy for the governments in place? And I think it might be different if you think about Chile and Uruguay. I don't know.
Yeah, big differences. Well, the first difference is, well, it's also concerning history, the history of the labor movements and the relationship with the left parties, which is different, has been different even in Brazil, because you have a new left, a new kind of trade unions, different from the Traballistas movement before the dictatorship. So it's you have different linkages between parties which are different. And I think one point to begin is how they suffer the liberal times. Well, of course, in Chile, they suffered the liberal times in a very hard way. And in the case of Uruguay, for instance, which could be an important difference, of course, the unions had a very bad time during the 90s, but they the Frente Amplio had a sort of two-pronged strategy. At the same time, they were a strong opposition to liberal measures, to liberal initiatives, and at the same time, they were gradually having a political moderation towards the center. So, and this was in a way followed by the unions. The unions were very strong, very weak in labor bargaining, and but they were rather strong in political unionism, and this was something done in two directions. One direction was opposing to liberal measures from the government, the different governments in the 90s. And this was not done following traditional classic means of class struggle, like strikes or street movements or street demonstrations. It was done through sort of electoral movement, through referendum against these measures, which changed the pattern of mobilization. You didn't have labor concentrated in labor bargaining, but you had labor concentrated in political mobilization against the measures through referendum, through votes, through ballots instead of strikes. And this has been sort of important thing for this. They arrive in a different condition when they come to the moment of the government, of the left government. The other thing is that this, in doing this, the unions have been a very important complement, a very important part of the electoral recruitment, of the political and ideological socialization and the political recruitment. So the Frente Amplio has developed in these two roads, very typically social democratic, the party road and the union road. So this is something that it's not exactly the same, well, in Chile of course not, and it's not exactly the same in Brazil. But to come to the second part of your question, if I follow it well, I think the unions can be considered a very important pillar to build up social democratic regimes. But they can also be considered a sort of, let's say, complicated partners, because they, and this is the case for Uruguay. When you come to, for instance, the left government has given important economic goods and political goods, political power to the unions. But the government didn't ask the unions something in exchange. There was not a sort of political exchange between political resources, power, and salaries, and labor conditions, and collective bargaining conditions, and reforms. And this is something that now the government has been sort of prisoner of his own pattern of brotherhood with the unions. This can be developed, if you want, in some cases. For instance, in state reform and education.
May I ask, what can the trade unions do in more complicated scenarios, like today in 2013, in countries like Colombia, for instance, where you have a situation in which the government policies seem to be responding to interests that are more related to the market forces. I mean, to make myself clear, you were talking about redistribution before. We have all these social democratic ideals in these constitutions of countries like Uruguay, of course, Colombia, and regional agreements as well. But how do we manage to have more coherent policies, not only at the national level but at the regional level, when it comes to, you were talking about liberal policies, how we are going to balance international pressures that come into these policies and affect trade unions and people in the daily lives. I'm talking about the consequences of bilateral trade agreements and all the policies that these countries negotiate within the World Trade Organization. And now with the new bilateral agreements that Chile has with the United States, or that countries like Colombia and Peru have recently negotiated with the European Union. There seems to be some sort of lack of coherence with these values and the way they try to articulate in procedurally within the country to redistribute better what neoliberalism is supposed to achieve at the end. Because some people say that neoliberal policies, there is some of religious. You know what I mean? They're very dogmatic. They provoke fear in the population. They promise paradise, but at the end, we don't really get there. And we've been talking about this in Latin America for decades. But it seems to be, for me at least, what I see is only my perspective. Market forces seems to be controlling these ideals, and we still need to be able to have more coherent policies at the regional level, at least in the Latin American process of integration with the CELAC and so on. And I don't really, I would like to hear more from you, because you know the political process deeper in those countries. But how we create more coherent policies to achieve those objectives in this neoliberal capitalism.
And that's a subject for a different seminar as well, which I think is very wordy. I don't know if you want to say some words about that before moving into your
Well, I wouldn't be able to answer about Colombia or special countries just outside these countries.
Maybe the Mercosur scenario, since you're
but
white.
I would say just the first question is, the first question is that the cycle of fortune of liberal policies is over. It's not finished, but it's not in the up. It's not at the top of the line. This is one point. Let's say beginning with the 2002 crisis, there is this point of inflection of the fortune of liberal arguments, policies, religion, as you very well say. It's not the same. That's one point. The other point is, if the forces, if the movement, if the parties in government are able to make that politics govern markets, or state, the relationship between state and economy, or the state and markets are more balanced. And the question is, well, I'm not an economist. You can see these different balances between, let's say, state and market. And in the case of Brazil, and Chile, for instance, and of course Uruguay, you have different balances. And this was all, it has to be said, it was something that also happened during the Keynesian era. There is that wonderful fresco of Schoenfield. Andrew Schoenfield made this idea of different balances between public and private, between politics and economy, between state and market, within the framework of the Keynesian era. So in each country, the balance is different. You have Chile with a very strong, important, very power of the market, because the liberal transition has been hard during Pinochet dictatorship. Brazil has had a sort of desarrollista state from the 30s and on, with militaries and civil rulers, with center, with left, with right. There are differences. You can say that, for instance, that even Fernando Henrique Cardoso made some privatizations, but the idea of a state-oriented economy, or state oriented, we could say, it's very, very strong in Brazil. And even when you come to the external economy, to the export economy, and with internal market, it's very, very strong, has been very strong. And in the case of Uruguay, you have this country which is camping around the state since the beginning. And this has not changed too much during the liberal period, because we had veto players inside of course, from the left, from the unions, but also inside the traditional parties, that stopped or limited the sale of the public enterprises, for instance. Then there you have the big enterprises in Uruguay are the public enterprises. So the difference are country to country very important. I couldn't talk about Colombia, but if you come to the three countries, they're very different situations, and there are very different situations coming to the system of labor relations. The left in government in Brazil and Chile improved the individual rights of the workers, but not the collective bargaining. Instead, in Uruguay, you have a revival of the old salary councils from the 40s, which that's an heritage from the 40s, and we have salary councils in the 40s, from the 40s to the middle of the 60s, and then you have a second period, a second time immediately after the democratic transition in 85, with a traditional party government, with a very important collective bargaining system from 85 to, let's say, 86, 87, short period, which was mainly meant to help to democratic consolidation, to let's say to reorganization of labor, and even reorganization of relationship between labor and business organization. This is very different situation. And when we come to the left government, there is the third period of the salary council, which is very important. But as I said, this was not followed by conditions, by asking something in exchange to the unions, and this is something that the government is suffering now. I don't think I have answered your question about the international level.
Yeah, there's always the question of how far can we make generalizations about Latin America, of course, and its position, and how far in individual countries. Now, we should be moving on to the case of Uruguay, I think, but do you have a brief question or comment on this?
You mentioned the political opinion of the population.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really the same in the three countries?
No,
Is
it's
it
not.
similar?
It's similar.
No.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's similar even in those countries which are considered more radical, as for instance Bolivia, which where of course there are some differences, but if you consider even the case of Bolivia, the center is very strong in Bolivia. Even in those countries are governments that are considered to be sort of refounding governments and very revolutionary or radical governments. This is also the case.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And perhaps in Chile, the right side of the citizenship, it's more strong, and in Brazil also. But you have this roughly 40 against 30, and then the middle, it's a strong 40, 45.
But mostly it's a very centrist tendency across all Latin America.
I think so. Mostly.
Yes.
Mostly. Yeah, it is more rightist in some countries. But the left is always limited to around the 30.
Yeah.
Of course, when you have a left government, the left electorate or the left population or the left public opinion, it's also bigger, but not very bigger. Two periods of the Frente Amplio in Uruguay, and we changed from around 25% to around 30%, 32%. It's not a huge change.
No.
You don't have societies in the left.
That's interesting.
Would you like to go on with the
Yeah.
Uruguayan case now?
If I find the
If you find the Uruguayan case.
if I find the
Small
Uruguay,
case. I don't know everything.
is a small notebook. Also, well, I have to go. So we can just sort of come into this same factors that I had mentioned in general. The first is to consider the comparative advantages, which are mainly two. First of all, the cycle of economic growth. This is something that most Latin American countries have. This is something coming from abroad, mainly.
Indeed.
The problem is how you manage to use this, let's say, this current of money coming inside the country. This is the main question, because all these countries have had important rents coming from commodities, from natural resources, from agriculture, not from industry mainly. That's the question. So this is the first advantage, which is also sort of risk or problem. The second is this point that I already mentioned about legacies. First, legacies considering the structure of the state, the institutional capacities of the state, and the public policy patterns. How public are the social policies, for instance. So in that case, we have two important legacies: the historical tradition of the Vallismo, which is sort of national progressive movement or sector in one of the traditional parties, and with an extraordinary importance, which had been considered sort of. I was thinking in Göran Lindahl, who was a fanatic of the Vallismo in Uruguay, and he wrote this book making the Vallismo as the building of democracy, of the building of social democracy even. And also this idea of a period of pro-market reforms, which has been rather limited and gradual because of this balance of better players, inter and intra-party competition. And this is when you come to, for instance, one of the oldest. You know that Uruguay has the oldest party democracy in Latin America and one of the oldest of the world. And these are the two-party democracy coming from the, let's say, the 1830s, 1840s, the middle of the 19th century. These two parties are, or this two-party system is one of the oldest in the world. It's considered to be the second or the third in the measures of ages of the party systems, together with the state, with the United States, with Switzerland, with England, and with Colombia, precisely. So these are the five: Colombia, Uruguay, United States, England, and in Switzerland. And the intra-party competition inside the two traditional parties was also very important. Not only the opposition of the left. The opposition of the left was sort of, we can say, I don't know if you can say in English, triangle politics. I mean, it was the left rising and growing, but the two other parties were also in competition, and they didn't disappear at all. So this triangle politics was very important to put limits to liberal reforms in Uruguay, inside the parties and outside the parties. So that's one comparative advantage. The second point is the power coefficient. You have a majority one-party government which is a big difference with the coalition governments in Brazil and Chile. You have a very strong presidential leadership in the case of Vasquez. You know that you are used to parliamentary governments. In parliamentary regimes, the chief of the party becomes the chief of the government. This is natural. This is the rule. Of course, sometimes you have the ghost of former prime ministers like Felipe González or Aznar in Spain, to mention a couple of ghosts for Rajoy or for Zapatero. But usually the chief of the party is it's the chief of the government. In presidential governments, it can be so, but it can be otherwise. So in this case, in the case of the first left government in Uruguay, Vasquez was at the same time the chief of the government, but he has been the strong chief, the strong leader of the Frente Amplio, let's say, for leadership built up along 15 years, very strong leadership. And this is not the case now in this new government, where Mujica is the chief of the government, but is not the chief of the party. And this is a difference that it's very important in the dynamics of the government. And the third point is the type of cabinet that you have. In the first government, we have a very cooperative cabinet of ministers, which was subject to two authorities or two hierarchies. The authority of the president, which was very, very strong, and the seniority, let's say, of the Minister of Economy, which was the present Vice President Astori. And these two hierarchies organized the cabinet, the entire cabinet. This is very important also point, which has not been, which has been in a similar case for Lula governments, but it has not been the same for Bachelet, for instance. Bachelet had many problems to deal with the party and to deal with the parties of the coalition and to deal with her own cabinet. That's something that perhaps she has learned, and now we will see which will be the next chapter of the picture, this film. So there is also that the Frente Amplio is a very strong party in government. The Frente Amplio has preserved to an important extent. Well, of course, when the party arrived to the government, the center of the power is going to the government and not to the party. This is always rule. But you can have different relationships between the government and the party government. And in this case, the relationship was rather balanced because the Frente Amplio was more keeping more organization, keeping more programmatic identities, and keeping more left positions in the even during the government of Tabaré Vázquez, and of course now. And this is very important. I don't have the time now, but I could show you the measures of the ideology of the party, of the government, and of the other parties and in the opposition, and it's an important thing. So there is another important thing. It's the Frente Amplio has won 2 elections with a majority in parliament. So from a technical point of view in political science, it is not yet a dominant party. You have to have these 3 elections with majority in parliament to be dominant. But it's a very dominant party, not only because they have it has had twice majority in parliament, but it has the government in Montevideo, the capital, since the 90s, 5 periods, in a capital that gathers about the 42% of the population and the voters. So that's one point. The other point is that the Frente Amplio has kept the control of education, of the educational system, the 3 levels, mainly the university and the secondary school, and it has also had important control, or if you want, influence in the cultural milieu. That it's coming from the 60s, and it is like that even today. So we have already talked about the linkage to the unions, and I would say that it's a sort of a amphibious party, because it has very quickly learned to live in the state and to live off the state in terms of power, in terms of careers, in terms of party reproduction. But it still keeps an important basis in civil society, which is not the case, for instance, for the Partido Socialista in Chile. So, trade unions I have already talked. I could say that with this condition of a very powerful government, you have quite an important government performance. First of all, in human rights, especially coming to the possibility of judgment of crimes during the dictatorship. Second, tax reform, including the progressive income tax, not very progressive because it's stopped at 25%. It is a very social democratic income tax because it's sort of a middle class and public employees income tax, and against captive contributors, taxpayers, and not against top rents. Well, this very important reform, which has been the revival of the salary councils in terms of labor rules, salary, and of course of power of the unions, and also sort of renewal of the old Uruguayan welfare state, mainly in family allowances, family allowances in Uruguay come also from the 40s, but they have been, let's say, reshaped in terms of more money, more people with this, especially women, head of families without husbands, or with husbands that we don't want to have close to the women. And this is an important point. It's something close to the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, and it has been also a health reform which has kept the importance of the private mutual organizations, and was considered to reinforce also the public services, but indeed I don't think they have reinforced the public services. So this has been mostly the main advance in the first government. The second government, which I don't have here in this presentation, has had perhaps 2 or 3 other important advances. I would say that one advance was in rights, in democratic rights, egalitarian marriage, laws against racial discrimination, and let's say in the field of democratic rights. That was quite important, and very important change is that Tabaré Vázquez was against abortion, and this government has passed the law to let's say to a better consideration of abortion. Instead, Tabaré Vázquez has put the presidential veto to the law that favored the abortion. It's a big discussion in Uruguay, and now, since Tabaré Vázquez is once more a candidate for the presidency, this discussion comes very often. So the other important thing in terms of the new government, it's energy, which is a policy in terms of renew sources of energy. That's perhaps the main, not acquisition, because this is something that we cannot expect to have effects immediately, but in terms of policies, of long-term policies. And there are other things which are also very important. Instead of insisting in the very ideological idea of that decentralization is good, which is something that this is politically correct. And Tabaré Vázquez has had this idea, and now this government has gone mainly in the direction that regional policies are important. In a very small country with very weak or rather weak local governments, the idea of regional contracts or interaction, it's a very important. I would say that's one important. And Mujica started his government saying that he will name sort of regional coordinators, which were sort of supra-intendentes governance. And of course, this didn't work. But instead, there have been sort of voluntary regionalization. I don't know if you say that in English, regionalización. In terms of contracts between or amongst different intendencias and projects, and this has been, let's say, using some conditions. The European Union projects sometimes ask to be more than one for some projects. That's important. And also the government asks to be more than one. For instance, for the development of the roads in the country. So this is also quite important. And of course, there is another chapter, but I don't. It's not my field. The chapter of the international relations and the regional relations, in which we have the main problems and also some steps in Mujica's government. Now, just to finish, I would say that the main pending matters in a government that has so much power, in fact, it's still the state reform, not in the public enterprises, which have been already reformed and important to an important extent. They are really most of the public enterprises are really quite good public services and good competitive enterprises. But in the field of ministers and public administration, that's a pending matter, especially when it comes to some very strategic ministers as foreign affairs, for instance, which is a hole in the Uruguayan landscape. The other extremely worrying pending matter is education. I could say that the first government, Tabaré Vázquez, has had a decision. We don't touch the education because it's a problem. It would be a trouble. It would be a big trouble. So we don't. I don't want to. They didn't say that, or he didn't say that in Lauer, but the consigna was that. And the second government was pathetic because education was considered to be the first priority, but they didn't have any idea how to reform it. They didn't have ideas. They didn't even have the courage of taking the ideas that have been yeah. Well, that's an important point. Somebody going out without with a book or something. This is library.
Yeah.
Perhaps. No problem. So there are other problems. One problem is to have a more competitive and less export dependent economy. This is not less export dependent, less commodity dependent economy. This is a problem for most countries in Latin America, perhaps not for Brazil. The other problem, also important to me, it's the recenter the economy and the social policy in work, and not in policy in money transfers, which is something that has been going up in all Latin American countries. And well, I think that also the regional policies are a big problem in the case of Uruguay, because we suffer of the neighborhood of Argentina and Brazil, and of the power of Brazil. And this has been very complicated for Uruguayan fellows since, well, I think 1726, when Montevideo was founded by the Spanish. I know. So, well, I would stop there, and if you have some questions or just...
Thank you very much for this overview. It's very revealing, both showing the conditions and also some of the problems and challenges that remain. Now, we are past time, so if you have to go, please go. But if you would like to stay, we can take perhaps 15-20 minutes for discussion and any questions that you have. And if I could just start by making a comment, I think that particularly were touched upon at the end, which is to what extent can it be said that the present, there's a doubt, I think to follow up on what you said, is this conjectural in a sense? The emergence of social democratic governments, is that driven by the high commodity prices, or are there more general aspects here? You mentioned Brazil as if that would be an exception, but also Brazil, I think, is suffering